The bullet was never meant for him, but he took it anyway. Without hesitation, without fear, a gray ghost hurled himself into the line of fire. Not for orders, not for glory, but because somewhere deep inside, he knew that truth deserved a heartbeat longer to survive. Under the ruins of a dying town, beneath the crumbling weight of betrayal and blood, one forgotten dog carried the last secret capable of tearing down a kingdom of lies. They called him a stray, a mistake, an animal broken beyond saving. They hunted him like a monster, spun stories about madness and disease to justify the bullets they fired. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the way he stood his ground when every human soul had lost their way. What mattered was the silent promise he made with teeth bared and eyes blazing. "You will not bury the truth while I still breathe." This is not a story of men in uniforms. This is the story of the one they left behind and the price he paid to remind them who they were meant to be. If you believe loyalty can outlive betrayal, if you still believe a single act of courage can shatter an empire built on fear, like this video, subscribe, and tell me, where are you watching from, and when did you realize the dog was never the broken one? The morning light filtered through the towering stained glass windows of Riverside Chapel, painting fractured rainbows across the polished wooden pews. A somber crowd dressed in dark, muted colors sat in heavy silence, their heads bowed, their hands tightly gripping crumpled tissues or rosary beads. The air was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and something more oppressive, an unspoken weight pressing on every chest. Beneath the solemn arch, at the center of the aisle, the dark oak casket bearing the body of Chief Richard Harrison was slowly being wheeled forward. Pallbearers, 6 in total, moved with synchronized steps, their faces pale with grief and duty. The minister stood waiting at the altar, his Bible held tightly against his chest. Every eye in the chapel followed the procession, every breath held as if breathing too loudly would desecrate the sacred moment. Then it happened. From the open cathedral doors behind them, a low growl sliced through the quiet. Heads turned, puzzled frowns knitting across foreheads. At first it was just a shadow, a ripple in the bright sunlight spilling onto the marble floor. Then, a figure emerged, a dog. But not just any dog, a large German shepherd, its coat a haunting shade of ashen gray, its frame lean and hardened, its posture rigid and electric with intensity. Its eyes were icy, almost otherworldly, locked onto the casket, as if drawn by an invisible thread. It moved with purpose, each step deliberate, its claws clicking lightly against the floor, echoing unervingly off the vaulted ceilings. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. The dog advanced, ignoring the startled ushers who reached out hesitantly, too stunned to act decisively. It stopped a few feet in front of the casket, blocking the pallbearer's path, its chest heaving, its gaze unwavering. Whispers rippled through the congregation. A few nervous titters rose and died, quickly silenced by sharp glares. Someone muttered, "What?" Another hissed, "Get it out of here." An usher finally found his nerve and approached, arms outstretched, speaking softly like one would to a skittish animal. "Easy, boy, easy." The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it lifted its head and released a sound that froze the marrow in every bone. A long, heart-wrenching howl, raw, primal, and soaked in a grief deeper than human understanding. The sound shattered the brittle composure of the mourners, some gasping audibly, others clutching each other in sudden terror. It wasn't just mourning, it was possibly terribly wrong. The minister dropped his Bible with a thud that seemed deafening in the sudden chaos. The pallbearers halted mid-step, exchanging bewildered glances, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. Deputy Chief William Parker, standing stiffly at the front, barked, "Get that animal out of here, this is a funeral, not a circus." But no one moved to obey. Even the officers, trained to react under pressure, stood rooted to the floor, as if recognizing on some instinctual level that this interruption wasn't random, that it was significant. The German shepherd lowered its head, its body vibrating with tension, its teeth slightly bared, not in threat but in a grimace of desperate urgency. Its tail stood rigid, and it emitted a series of low, warning growls, its eyes never leaving the casket. Sarah Harrison, the widow, sitting in the front pew in a veil of black, pressed a trembling hand to her chest. She stared at the dog, her face ghostly pale, her lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps in dread. Her sister leaned over, whispering sharply, "Sarah, do you know that dog?" Sarah shook her head, almost imperceptibly, but her eyes, those haunted wide eyes, told another story. Minutes dragged like hours. The minister finally regained some composure, clearing his throat. Perhaps the dog senses the chief's spirit," he said, voice quivering. "Animals often feel what we cannot." His attempt to spiritualize the moment failed miserably. No one bought it. The discomfort thickened, the air nearly humming with it. The German shepherd took a step forward. The pallbearers recoiled instinctively, almost dropping the casket in their panic. The dog sniffed the air, its hackles raised, its entire body poised as if ready to lunge. Someone at the back of the chapel, the Old Town veterinarian, muttered under his breath, "That's not grief. That's alarming. That's..." Deputy Parker barked again, louder, angrier. "Remove that damn dog now." His voice cracked at the end, a hairline fracture of fear betraying him. Two uniformed officers moved hesitantly forward, but as they approached, the dog's growl deepened into a rumbling snarl that vibrated on the stone floor. It was not a threat, it was a warning. The crowd, sensing something monumental teetering on the edge of eruption, stayed frozen. An old woman clutched her grandson tighter to her chest. A former Marine seated near the aisle leaned forward, his knuckles white on the pew in front of him, a deep frown cutting into his weathered face. The officers paused. The German shepherd stared them down, then turned its head sharply back toward the casket and howled again, this time shorter, sharper, more urgent. Something inside that casket wasn't right. Something alive, terrifying, was clawing at the very soul of this funeral. And in that suspended breath of terror, the entire chapel understood. This was no mere interruption. This was a warning from beyond reason, beyond words. The casket had not yet reached the altar, but something else had arrived. A ghost, a reckoning, and it wore the form of a wounded, relentless beast. The German shepherd stood frozen, its body coiled tight like a spring wound to breaking. The entire chapel sat suspended in a breathless, electric silence, the casket barely 5 feet from the altar. Then, with no further warning, the dog lunged forward, snarling low, powerful muscles surging as it closed the distance in 2 strides. The pallbearers stumbled back in panic, almost dropping the casket again. The wooden cart underneath rattled violently as the dog collided with it, his massive paws slamming against the rich, polished mahogany with a thud that reverberated through the cathedral like a gunshot. The congregation gasped in horror as the dog began clawing madly at the top portion of the coffin, right over where Chief Harrison's heart should have been. Long, deep gouges tore through the pristine lacquer, shards of varnished wood flying in all directions. His claws scratched and dug with a desperate frenzy, a maniacal urgency, as if he could rip the secrets free from the dead man's chest. Deputy Chief Parker shouted furiously, "Get that animal away from there!" But no one moved, paralyzed by the sheer violence and strangeness of the moment. Even the officers hesitated, their hands twitching near their belts, but not daring to step forward. It wasn't just rage driving the dog, it was something else entirely. Something no one could name but everyone could feel. Fear, raw and heavy, seeped into the pews like smoke. Sarah Harrison rose shakily to her feet, her hand pressed to her mouth as a choked sob escaped. Her sister tried to pull her back down, whispering harshly, "Sarah, sit, don't." But Sarah's eyes never left the dog or the casket. She knew. Somewhere deep inside, she knew. The German shepherd clawed again, his nails screeching against the casket's surface. His body quivered, not with aggression, but with something deeper, anguish. His head twisted, snapping his gaze across the faces of the mourners, as if pleading, begging someone to understand. His chest heaved, his eyes burned blood red under the strain of whatever invisible burden crushed him. They weren't the eyes of a dog gone feral. They were the eyes of a soul witnessing something unspeakable. Detective Michael Carson finally broke the paralysis. Pushing past stunned mourners, he moved toward the casket, his instincts screaming that this wasn't random. His years on the force had taught him to trust signs others dismissed. He slowed as he neared the dog, lowering his hands, palms out, voice low. "Steady. Easy, boy, it's okay. Tell me what you're seeing." The German shepherd stopped tearing at the wood, just long enough to turn his searing gaze toward Carson. The detective's gut twisted painfully. There was terror in those canine eyes, recognition too, and worse, an almost human sorrow. Carson took another cautious step, heart hammering. The dog let out a low, mournful whine, his body trembling from nose to tail. His head dipped, nose pressing against the damaged wood, and he whined again, longer this time, a sound that made Carson's blood run cold. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was grief, it was horrible. Behind him, murmurs grew louder. A woman near the back whispered hoarsely, "Something's wrong, open it." Someone opened the coffin. Another voice chimed in, "Maybe it's not him in there, maybe it's someone else." The ripple of unease spread like wildfire, igniting old suspicions that had lain buried under layers of mourning rituals and polite silence. Deputy Parker barked orders again, ordering officers to restrain the dog, but no one obeyed. Even the most loyal men felt it, the wrongness, the sour rot of something deeply unnatural. Carson pressed his hand against the lid of the casket, feeling the vibrations from the dog's frantic scratching just beneath his fingers. The wood was solid, cold, but under the surface, the German Shepherd sat suddenly, his entire body sagging as if the energy had been drained from him in an instant. He let out a soft, keening sound, head bowed so low his muzzle nearly touched the floor. His sides heaved as though every breath was a struggle. The congregation watched in mute terror as thick tears welled in the dog's red-rimmed eyes and dripped silently into the dog. A wave of nausea rolled over Carson. Dogs didn't cry. Not like that, not unless he shoved the thought away before it could fully form. He turned to face the silent, wide-eyed crowd, his voice rough and uncertain. "We need to open the casket," he said. "Now." Parker's face went crimson with fury. "Absolutely not. You'll desecrate the chief's memory. This is outrageous." But the minister, his hands shaking, stepped forward and laid a trembling hand on Parker's arm. "Deputy," he said quietly, I think we owe it to Richard to be sure." The old man's voice cracked halfway through, but he stood firm. More nods rippled through the crowd, an unspoken agreement, a collective realization. Parker looked around, realizing he had lost them. He cursed under his breath and gestured violently to two junior officers. "Fine, do it, but remember you're all witnesses. When the press gets wind of this circus, don't come." Carson didn't waste time. He approached the casket, hands steady now, though his heart jackhammered in his chest. He unclasped the ornate gold latches one by one, each click loud enough to echo through the deathly stillness. The German Shepherd didn't move. He simply sat there, a silent sentinel, watching, waiting. The last latch gave way with a metallic snap. Carson placed his palms on the heavy lid, ready to lift. The congregation leaned forward in collective breathlessness, every muscle tense, every eye unblinking. Carson hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, with a grunt, he heaved the lid upward. The hinges creaked, and the world inside the chapel shifted. The heavy lid of the casket creaked as Detective Carson lifted it. The metallic groan through the stunned silence of the chapel. The German Shepherd, motionless now, watched intently, his body tense like a stretched wire ready to snap. As the casket cracked open, an overwhelming stench escaped, a metallic, sour scent of death, and something else, something wrong. The first glimpse inside revealed not the neatly prepared body of Chief Harrison that everyone had expected, but a form wrapped haphazardly in the wrong uniform, the insignias crudely sewn onto a jacket that looked suspiciously too large for the figure it covered. Carson froze, a cold sweat breaking out along his spine. Before he could react, a sudden strangled gasp echoed through the chapel. Sarah Harrison, who had been standing mere feet away, let out a broken sob and collapsed, her body crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut. A few mourners rushed forward, catching her just before her head hit the polished marble floor. Her sister screamed her name, shaking her desperately, but Sarah remained limp, her face ghostly pale, her fingers twitching faintly. Panic spread through the chapel like ripples on a still pond disturbed by a stone. Murmurs rose, hushed at first, then louder, feeding off each other in a growing wave of dread. Why did she faint? Did she see something? Was it even the chief in there? The whispers grew teeth, biting into the fragile illusion of order. Suspicion hung heavy in the air, thick as smoke. Carson's hands trembled slightly as he pulled the lid further open. revealing more of the body. It didn't take long to see it clearly. This was not Chief Harrison. The skin tone was wrong, the facial structure obscured by hasty, clumsy mortician's work that could not hide the truth. The corpse wore the chief's medals, his uniform, even bore a faint scar where Harrison had once spoken proudly of taking a bullet during a standoff. But everything else was off, fundamentally wrong in a way that could not be unseen. A low murmur of horror spread through the crowd. Someone cursed under their breath. An elderly woman clutched her rosary so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Carson stepped back, bile rising in his throat. Deputy Parker's face turned a dangerous shade of red. He stormed forward, his voice a whip crack in the heavy air. "Shut that casket now, this is an outrage." His eyes darted around, wild and calculating, as if gauging how much control he still held. "You're desecrating the chief's memory." But AP could see the growing doubt in the eyes of the congregation. The way people leaned in, whispered, pointed, one voice, clear and young, cut through the confusion. "That's not him," said Officer Jamie Brooks, the youngest member of the force, barely 2 years out of the academy. His voice didn't waver. His eyes, wide but steady, were locked on the body in the casket. "That's not Chief Harrison." Parker whirled on him, his finger jabbing the air. "You're out of line, officer." But Jamie didn't back down. He moved forward, stepping past Parker with a kind of grim determination that drew every eye in the room. His hands were steady as he reached into the casket, pulling aside the poorly arranged ceremonial flag to expose more of the body beneath. A collective gasp tore from the crowd. The corpse's hands thinner, smaller. The nails bitten to the quick told the story without words. This wasn't Chief Harrison. It wasn't even a senior officer. "Who is this?" someone cried out, voice cracking. Jamie leaned closer, scanning the face, the hands, the scraps of civilian clothing beneath the uniform. His mouth twisted into a grimace. "This is a John Doe," he said, his voice low but carrying through the shocked hush. The German shepherd let out a low whine, his head bowing as if in mourning, or perhaps frustration. Carson glanced down at him, feeling the pieces shifting in his mind. A puzzle he didn't yet know how to solve, but that he knew was horrifying beyond anything he had ever encountered. Sarah Harrison stirred where she had fallen, groaning faintly as her sister tried to revive her. Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused, then locked onto the casket and the broken body that wasn't her husband. She ragged cry escaped her lips, filled with a grief so sharp and raw it physically hurt to hear. She struggled to sit up, tears streaming down her face. "Where is he?" she sobbed. "Where is Richard?" No one had an answer. Carson looked around the room, seeing the growing panic, the widening cracks in the facade. This wasn't just a botched funeral. This was something darker, something deliberate. Parker was shouting again, calling for the casket to be closed in order to be restored, but no one was listening anymore. Authority, once absolute, was crumbling under the weight of unspoken questions and gnawing fear. Jamie turned to Carson, his jaw tight. "Sir, permission to secure the casket for forensic investigation?" he asked. His voice clipped, militarily, trying desperately to cling to procedure in a world tilting off its axis. Carson nodded grimly. "Do it." The young officer set about carefully photographing the body, documenting every irregularity, the misaligned stitching on the uniform, the absence of known scars, the wrong dental structure barely hidden beneath poorly applied makeup. Evidence was piling up, damning and undeniable. The German shepherd remained sitting vigil, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His eyes haunted. Carson knelt beside him, resting a tentative hand on the dog's sturdy back. The fur was damp with sweat, the muscles trembling under his palm. "You knew before any of us." The dog pressed his head against Carson's knee, in a gesture of exhausted relief. Or maybe quiet encouragement. Carson rose, facing the congregation. "Everyone needs to stay here. No one leaves until we understand what happened." The murmurs rose again, 1,000 tiny storms swirling into something larger, something unstoppable. Suspicion turned its hungry gaze on everyone. The ushers, the pallbearers, the uniformed officers. And somewhere out there beyond the chapel walls, someone was watching, waiting. And they knew the secret wasn't buried yet. The weight of realization crashed down upon the chapel like a thunderclap muffled only by the heavy air of disbelief. Carson wiped the cold sweat from his brow and leaned closer over the casket, careful not to disturb the thin, sagging flesh of the unknown corpse. Something caught his eye, something out of place, a small fold of paper barely visible beneath the edge of the stiff, oversized collar. His instincts prickled instantly. He slipped on a pair of latex gloves and delicately reached inside, his fingers brushing the brittle cloth of the ill-fitting uniform before finding the slip tucked carefully between layers. It wasn't random. Someone had placed it there for a reason. He unfolded the paper slowly, his heart hammering so violently he felt it in his teeth. In small, sharp handwriting like a blade were the words, "I am not dead. Do not trust anyone in this room." Carson stared, the words searing into his brain, a tremor running through his hand as he held the message up to the light. He read it again, needing to be sure he hadn't misunderstood. But there it was, undeniable and chilling. He looked up, sweeping his gaze across the stunned faces of the mourners, the officers, the ministers, every soul now suspect, every friend a potential betrayer. He folded the note swiftly and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his mind spinning furiously. He couldn't reveal this yet. Not here. Not when every move might be watched. The German Shepherd watched him too, eyes bright and alert, as if understanding that a new and far more dangerous layer had just peeled back to reveal something monstrous beneath. Deputy Chief Parker was still fuming near the altar, barking orders for the body to be covered, for the scene to be controlled, but the congregation had shifted subtly. They were no longer obedient mourners. They were wolves scenting blood, sensing that the chain of command had rotted from within. Carson needed more than just a letter. He needed proof that could stand against the tidal wave of lies already crashing around them. His mind raced through possibilities, snapping to one glaring oversight. The cameras. He turned sharply to Jamie Brooks. "I need footage from the morgue," Carson said under his breath, his voice low, urgent. "Right now, before anyone else touches it." Jamie nodded grimly and slipped away through the crowd, blending into the churn of restless bodies like smoke. Carson turned back to the casket, covering it hastily with the ceremonial flag as if that could shield the grotesque truth from the already fraying edges of sanity in the room. Minutes dragged into lifetimes. The chapel buzzed with low, anxious conversation, pockets of speculation growing louder, bolder. Sarah Harrison remained slumped against her sister's shoulder, her face a mask of grief and disbelief. Finally, Jamie returned, his face pale, his hands empty. Carson moved quickly to intercept him, dragging him behind a thick marble column near the entrance. Jamie whispered, "The feeds are gone, nothing from the last 24 hours." Carson's stomach turned to stone. "Gone." Jamie shook his head. "Scrubbed, not corrupted, deliberately erased. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. System logs show the cameras were disabled manually about 2 hours before the body was prepared for transport." Carson exhaled a slow, burning breath. 2 hours before the funeral. 2 hours in which anything could have been done to the body or switched entirely. He felt the walls of the chapel closing in, the air tightening around his throat. Who had access? He asked, though deep down he already feared the answer. Jamie hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Only a few people, morgue supervisor, the forensic team, and Deputy Chief William Parker, the man who had been Chief Harrison's best friend for 2 decades, the man who had stood at his side through riots, through courtrooms, through victories and scandals alike, the man who, now, barked louder than anyone else to suppress the truth. It was almost too perfect, too obvious, which made it infinitely more dangerous. Carson narrowed his eyes, weighing the growing mountain of betrayals against the thin, fragile thread of loyalty he had once believed unbreakable. He thought of the letter again, burning a hole through his jacket, a whispered scream in ink telling him not to trust anyone. He needed to move fast, before Parker realized the mistake he'd made, before the trail went cold forever. The German Shepherd stood suddenly, his ears twitching sharply toward the far side of the chapel. His body stiffened, hackles rising. Carson followed the dog's line of sight and spotted Parker speaking urgently into a small device hidden in his palm, his mouth barely moving, his expression tight. Carson cursed under his breath. Whatever was happening, it was already accelerating. He motioned to Jamie, pulling him close. "Find Officer Riley and Officer Kim. Tell them to secure the perimeter. No one leaves, no one." Jamie nodded and disappeared again, weaving through the growing storm of whispers and suspicion. Carson stepped forward, weaving through pews and startled mourners toward Parker, who stiffened when he noticed the approach. "Deputy," Carson said, keeping his tone even, his hands loose at his sides, "we need to talk." Parker offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Later, detective. We have a funeral to salvage." "Now," Carson insisted, stepping closer, lowering his voice to a razor-thin edge, "before this circus tears itself apart." Their eyes locked, two battle-hardened men measuring the distance between loyalty and betrayal. For a heartbeat, it seemed neither would move. Then Parker shifted, his expression relaxing into something oily, insincere. "Of course," he said, pocketing the small device with practiced ease. "After all, transparency is key." He gestured for Carson to follow him toward the small vestry off the main chapel. Carson hesitated, his mind whirring. The German Shepherd growled lowly, sensing the trap before the man even recognized it. But Carson followed anyway, heart pounding, the letter in his pocket burning hotter with every step. Behind him, unseen by either man, another figure slipped from the chapel's shadowed rear exit, moving swiftly, silently, carrying something glinting and deadly in the folds of their coat. The vestry door clicked shut behind them, muting the rising hum of chaos outside. Parker turned, his face set in a mask of calm, but Carson saw the tightness at the corners of his mouth, the tension thrumming beneath the surface like a wire pulled taut. Before Carson could speak, the German Shepherd shouldered into the room, slipping past the door before it latched, planting himself squarely between Carson and Parker. His hackles bristled, his muscles bunched, every inch of him radiating silent warning. Parker laughed, a brittle sound that didn't touch his eyes. "You're trusting a stray now, Carson? Getting soft in your old age?" Carson didn't blink. "He's not a stray." His voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of steel. For a moment, Parker hesitated. Then something flickered across his face, something like recognition. Carson caught it, filed it away. He crouched beside the dog, running a hand lightly down the animal's back, feeling the old scars hidden beneath the thick gray fur. 5 parallel lines across the ribcage, a notch missing from the left ear. Memory clicked into place. "You're not just any canine, are you, boy?" Carson murmured. The German Shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but his eyes never left Parker. 5 years ago, Carson had read the reports, buried deep in the classified archives, about a canine named Ghost, an elite animal assigned to covert ops, trained beyond the standard police protocols, deployed in missions so sensitive they barely existed on paper. Ghost had gone missing during a disastrous operation overseas, presumed dead along with his handler in a blaze that had taken out half a compound. Nobody had ever been recovered, yet here he was, not dead, not broken, watching Parker with the kind of loathing that only came from betrayal. Carson rose slowly, blood pounding in his ears. "You knew," he said, his voice low. "You knew exactly who he was the moment you saw him." Parker's face shuddered, the genial mask dropping to something colder, harder. "You're reaching," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Carson didn't argue. He knew better. The truth was already unraveling thread by poisoned thread. There was still too much he didn't know, too many pieces scattered across a battlefield he couldn't yet see. He needed leverage, he needed witnesses, and he knew exactly where to start. He turned on his heel and strode out of the vestry, ignoring Parker's muttered curses behind him. The German Shepherd, Ghost, followed at his side, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. "Sure, we've detained the morgue staff for questioning. They're in the antechamber." "Good," Carson said. "Bring the head tech to me. Now." Minutes later, a nervous, sweating man in a stained white lab coat stood fidgeting in front of Carson. His name tag read, Mason Tully, mid-30s, pale as paper, his hands wringing the hem of his coat until the fabric twisted. Carson wasted no time. "Mason, listen carefully. We know the cameras were shut down 2 hours before the body was moved. We know the real Chief Harrison isn't in that casket. We know someone inside helped make that happen. I need you to tell me what you saw. Who gave the orders? Mason swallowed hard, darting a look toward the chapel doors where Parker loomed like a specter. I can't, he stammered. You didn't have a choice. They said. Carson stepped closer, lowering his voice to a razor whisper. They said what, Mason? Mason's gaze flicked to Ghost, the dog sitting rock-still, staring at him with unnerving intensity. Something in the animal's presence seemed to strip away lies like peeling paint. Mason's shoulders sagged. His voice cracked. It was Deputy Chief Parker, he whispered. He came down himself, said we had to make the switch, said if we didn't cooperate, bad things would happen. To us, to our families. A collective intake of breath hissed through the few officers standing nearby. Jamie's fists clenched at his sides. Carson felt a grim satisfaction settle over him, cold and heavy. Confirmation. Proof. Did he threaten you with? Carson pressed. Mason shook his head, tears starting to leak from the corners of his eyes. He didn't have to, he showed me. Pictures. My wife, my kid, walking home from school. He knew where we lived, what time did they leave the house. He knew everything. Jamie swore under his breath. Carson forced himself to stay calm, to stay focused. And the body, where did it come from? Mason wiped his nose on his sleeve. John Doe. Found in the alley behind East Market 3 nights ago. No ID, no fingerprints. Beat to hell before he died. The medical examiner was going to log him as an overdose. They pulled him before the paperwork even filed. Carson's stomach twisted. A disposable body for a disposable lie. Where's the real chief? Carson asked. Mason shook his head, panic flashing. I don't know, I swear, after we loaded the fake body into the transport, Parker said the rest was handled. That's all he said. Handled. The word echoed in Carson's mind, a bell tolling for something too terrible to name yet. He dismissed Mason with a nod, signaling 2 officers to keep him secure. Carson turned, his gaze sweeping the chapel, noting the widening spaces between people, the way suspicion and fear peeled them apart like layers of rot. Ghost bumped his leg lightly with his nose, a silent prod. We're running out of time. Carson knew it. Parker was moving faster now, rallying the loyalists, whispering poison into the ears of the weak and fearful. If they didn't act soon, everything about the chief's life, the town's future, the truth itself would be buried so deep it would never see daylight again. He felt the shift before he heard it. A subtle disturbance near the rear exit, a ripple of wrongness that set every instinct on fire. He spun, hand reaching instinctively for the weapon holstered at his side. Ghost snarled low, a rumble like distant thunder, and lunged forward without hesitation. Carson drew his weapon in a single, smooth motion, stepping toward the disturbance at the rear exit. Ghost at his side, a shadow of raw power and silent fury. The chapel fractured into chaos, people scattering from the pews, knocking over chairs and candles as they scrambled for cover. The low, guttural growl from Ghost slicing through the growing panic like a knife through silk. Carson's eyes locked on a figure near the doorway, a man in plain clothes, too casual. The man's hand dipped beneath his jacket, the glint of metal catching the light. Gun! Carson roared, raising his own weapon, but Ghost was faster. The dog launched forward, a missile of gray muscle and snarling teeth, slamming into the man's midsection with brutal precision. The man crumpled to the ground, the pistol clattering from his grasp and skidding across the marble floor. Officers rushed to secure him, yanking his arms behind his back, pressing his face against the cold stone. But Carson's mind was already elsewhere, racing ahead, fitting pieces together at breakneck speed. This wasn't a random assassin. This was a cleanup. Someone wanted every loose end tied off before the truth could claw its way into the daylight. He strode over, crouching beside the subdued man. Who sent you? Carson growled. The man smirked, blood trailing from his busted lip, and said nothing. Ghost barked once, sharp and commanding. The man's bravado cracked just slightly. Carson leaned closer. You're already dead, he said quietly. The only thing you can still choose is whether you burn alone or take them with you. The man's smirk faded. His eyes darted toward Parker, standing rigid across the room. His fists clenched so tightly the veins bulged against his skin. Carson saw it. He saw everything. He stood, holstering his weapon, and turned back toward Jamie Brooks, who was already locking down the exits, securing the building. But it wasn't enough. They were fighting shadows now. Enemies who didn't need badges or uniforms. Enemies woven into the fabric of the town itself. And Chief Harrison had known. Carson thought back to the endless late-at-night conversations, the half-finished sentences, the guarded glance. He had thought it was just the burden of leadership weighing on his old friend. He had been wrong. It wasn't the burden of leadership. It was the burden of knowing too much. Months before his supposed death, Harrison had been compiling a dossier, an exhaustive, damning record of corruption, bribery, drug trafficking, human exploitation, all rooted deep within the highest levels of city government and beyond. Council members, judges, prosecutors. Names that appeared squeaky clean in public but bled filth behind closed doors. Harrison had planned to take them down. He had gathered evidence meticulously, painfully, one tarried financial record after another. He had been days away from turning it all over to federal investigators. And then, he died. Or rather, he died. Carson's stomach twisted as the full horror unfurled before him. The funeral was never about honoring Harrison's service. It was a funeral for the truth itself. A burial not just of a man but of everything he had fought to expose. The fake death was step one. Kill the symbol, create confusion, paralyze the town with grief and fear. But step two was worse. Step two was the real objective. To find Harrison wherever he was hiding and erase him permanently. No evidence, no witnesses, no questions. Carson moved through the chapel like a storm contained by sheer force of will, issuing rapid orders, securing the prisoner, confiscating phones, and locking down communication. He couldn't trust the outside. He could barely trust the inside. Ghost paced at his side, restless, sensing the rising stakes. Jamie reappeared at his shoulder, his face tight. "Sir, we found something in the suspect's pocket." He handed over a small, battered flash drive. Carson turned it over in his fingers. A tiny, unremarkable piece of plastic and metal, yet it thrummed with the promise of secrets. He didn't dare plug it into any unsecured device. He slipped it into an evidence bag, sealing it tightly. "Get it to our safe house," Carson ordered. "Encrypted analysis only. No networks, no transmissions. Hand carry it yourself if you have to." Jamie nodded, already moving. Carson turned back to the chapel, feeling the noose tightening. Parker was gone, slipped away in the confusion. And if Parker was running, then worse was coming. The German Shepherd whined low in his throat, pulling slightly against Carson's side. His nose pointed toward the main entrance. "Something outside, something is wrong." Carson followed without hesitation, Ghost leading the way into the storm that was building just beyond the stained glass doors. Outside, the town square looked eerily normal. Families crossing the street, a few teenagers skateboarding, a man walking his dog. Normal, but too perfect. A stage set, a trap waiting for the curtain to rise. Ghost growled again, deeper this time. Carson's gut twisted. They weren't just cleaning up the funeral, they were cleaning up the entire investigation. Anyone who knew the truth or even suspected it was a target now. He needed to find Harrison. Fast, before the town buried him again, this time for real. The square looked like any ordinary afternoon snapshot of small-town life, but Carson knew better than to trust appearances now. His hand hovered near his weapon, every nerve stretched taut as Ghost led him forward, the dog's ears flat against his skull, his body low and deliberate. They reached the edge of the plaza when a voice cut sharply across the noise. Low but firm, threading through the confusion like a lifeline. "Detective Carson," it called. Carson turned sharply, hand instinctively tightening around the grip of his gun, until he spotted a figure moving quickly toward him from the direction of the library. A woman, mid-40s, slight build, a shock of curly auburn hair tucked beneath a faded baseball cap, her hands clutching a worn leather satchel against her chest like it contained something far more precious than its battered appearance suggested. Recognition hit him like a slap. "Lena Hart," he breathed, barely believing it. Once the town's most tenacious investigative reporter, Lena had vanished after a brutal expose on city corruption almost got her killed. An expose only possible because Harrison had saved her life when powerful enemies had tried to silence her. Carson hadn't seen her in years, and had assumed, like most, that she was long gone, hiding somewhere safer than this broken town. But now she was here, weaving through the cautious clusters of townspeople, her eyes darting, her movements fast but contained, purposeful. Ghost stiffened beside him, his muscles vibrating with tension. But Carson laid a calming hand on his back. Lena reached him, her breath shallow, her face taut with urgency. Without preamble, she shoved the satchel into his chest. "You need this," she said, her voice rough from disuse or fear or both. "Richard left it for me in case something happened. I didn't know if I'd ever get a chance to deliver it." Carson pulled the bag open and his breath caught. Inside, stacked neatly, were dozens of files, photographs, a few small hard drives, even a thumb-thick notebook crammed with Harrison's tight, familiar handwriting. Names, dates, transactions. Photographs of clandestine meetings, blurred images of handshakes exchanged under dim parking lot lights. The rot was deeper and more widespread than even Carson had dared to imagine. This was a death warrant against half the town's leadership. Ghost nudged the satchel with his nose, whimpering softly. He recognized the scent, the connection. Harrison's hand had touched these papers. Carson looked at Lena, reading the fear etched into every line of her face. "They'll come after you," he said quietly. "You already have," she replied, a ghost of a bitter smile flickering and dying. "But if Richard had the guts to stand, I sure as hell won't run now." Before Carson could answer, Ghost tensed beside him, his head whipping around toward a cluster of officers gathered near the town hall steps. Carson followed his gaze instantly. Ghost's body language changed, sharpened from cautious to hyper-focused, his nose lifted, tasting the air. A growl, low and deep, rumbled from his throat. Carson's heart slammed once against his ribs. Ghost had caught a scent he knew. The German shepherd stalked forward, muscles rippling under his coat, moving with the inexorable force of a homing missile. Carson matched his pace, heart hammering. The group of officers began to shift uncomfortably as they noticed the approach. One man in particular, a tall, square-shouldered captain named Grant Monroe, stepped back instinctively, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. Ghost snarled, a raw, savage sound that froze everyone in their tracks. His body went rigid, teeth bared, hackles standing on end. His gaze locked onto Monroe with an intensity that dared anyone to move. Carson didn't need Ghost to tell him. He saw in Monroe's face the flicker of recognition, of fear. Grant Monroe, decorated twice for valor, praised publicly by Harrison himself, had betrayed them. He was one of the architects behind the substitution of the body, one of the architects of the coming purge. Monroe raised his hands slowly, trying to calm the situation, his voice slick and measured. "Easy there, detective. The dog's confused. There's a lot going on. Stressful for everyone." But Carson saw through the performance, through the polished uniform and the empty words. Ghost wasn't confused. Ghost remembered. 5 years ago, the scandal that had buried the Special Ops unit wasn't just bad luck. It had been sabotaged from within. And Monroe had been involved even then. The dog had been there, fighting to survive betrayal and fire, losing his handler to a bullet likely fired by one of their own. And now, faced with one of the architects of that betrayal, Ghost had no hesitation. Carson spoke, his voice cutting through the gathering tension like steel. "Grant Monroe, you are under investigation for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to attempted murder. Place your hands behind your head and get on your knees." For a moment, but then Monroe moved faster than anyone expected, his hand diving for his gun. Ghost exploded into motion, and Carson's finger tightened on the trigger. Monroe's hand barely brushed the grip of his weapon before Ghost collided with him, teeth flashing, muscles coiled with brutal efficiency. The force of the impact sent Monroe sprawling backward onto the pavement, his gun skidding uselessly across the concrete. Carson moved in an instant, kicking the weapon farther out of reach, planting his knee firmly against Monroe's chest as he yanked his arms behind him and snapped cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The crowd around them stirred, whispering and backing away, their collective fear curdling into suspicion and anger. Ghost circled them, his sharp gaze scanning the square, searching for threats hidden among the milling onlookers. His fur bristled, his breathing heavy but controlled. As Carson finished securing Monroe, his hand brushed against Ghost's collar and felt something strange tucked beneath it, something hard and unfamiliar. He frowned, reaching beneath the thick gray fur, his fingers closing around a small, tightly wrapped object. He pulled it free. It was a cell phone. A battered, scuffed old burner phone, taped tightly and camouflaged within Ghost's fur, where no one would have thought to look. Carson's heart raced as he turned it over in his palm. It was still on. A single message flashed across the cracked screen. "Play me." Carson hesitated only a moment before pressing the button. A recording began to play, faint but clear enough to cut through the background noise. Harrison's voice, rough but steady, filled the air. "You're hearing this, I didn't make it out. Parker is compromised. Monroe too. They're working with elements far above our pay grade. They're laundering money, fixing trials, running protection for traffickers. I have evidence. Names, dates, transactions. I hid them. With Ghost. He'll lead you if you trust him. Don't trust the department. Don't trust the mayor. Trust only the dog." The message ended. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then the shouting began. Someone screamed about a conspiracy. Another demanded Monroe's execution. Officers pushed through the growing chaos, shouting orders, waving batons, trying to corral a situation slipping rapidly out of their control. Carson pocketed the phone, his mind a whirl of calculations and worst-case scenarios. He had what he needed to destroy Parker's network, but only if he could get it somewhere safe, somewhere it couldn't be silenced. Ghost nudged his thigh, urging him to move, to act. And that's when the first warning shots cracked through the air. Deputy Chief Parker, flanked by a handful of loyal officers, strode into the square, a metaphor in one hand and a cold gleam in his eye. His voice boomed over the chaos, sharp and authoritative. "Everyone clear the square, this dog is a threat. It's rabid. It attacked a decorated officer and is endangering civilians. We have authorization to put it down immediately for public safety." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "No," Carson roared by the rising panic, the confusion Parker expertly sowed like a poisoned wind. Parker pointed at Ghost, sneering. "Shoot to kill, neutralize it now." Several officers hesitated, their rifles uncertainly raised. Some looked confused, others grimly determined. They didn't know the truth, or worse, they didn't care. Carson moved instinctively, positioning himself between Ghost and the barrels of the rifles. "This dog isn't rabid," he shouted. "He's carrying evidence. He's the only reason any of you know what's really going on." But Parker was a master manipulator, and fear was his favorite weapon. "He's out of control," Parker shouted back, his voice a whip across the crowd. "He's a threat to your wives, your children, your lives. Don't let him hurt anyone else." The first rifle cracked a warning shot into the ground near Carson's foot, scattering chips of stone. Ghost snarled, teeth bared, but didn't move from Carson's side. Around them, the town square was descending into something worse than chaos. Hysteria. Parents grabbed their children and fled. Store owners slammed shut their windows. The elderly clutched each other and prayed. And in the middle of it all, Carson stood, shielding the battered dog who had become the last living thread tying them to the truth. Jamie Brooks reappeared at Carson's side, panting, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. "Sir, we've got backup coming from the precinct 5 minutes out. But they don't know who to trust. Parker's already spun the narrative. They think we're rogue. Then we hold," Carson said grimly. "No matter what." Jamie nodded tightly. Carson knelt quickly, running his hands over Ghost's body, searching for anything else, any clue. His fingers brushed another lump beneath the harness, tucked between the layers. A small USB drive warm against the dog's skin. Evidence. All the pieces were here. They just needed to survive long enough to use them. A second shot rang out, closer this time, ricocheting off the stone steps behind them. Carson pulled Ghost closer, adrenaline surging. They couldn't stay in the open. They needed cover, and fast. Gunfire cracked through the town square like a sudden storm, sharp, chaotic, terrifying. Carson threw himself behind a thick stone pillar, dragging Ghost with him as bullets whined and sparked against the marble. Jamie dived beside him, breathing hard, his service weapon already drawn and ready. Across the plaza, Parker's hand-picked strike team fanned out with military precision, black tactical gear gleaming under the sun, rifles sweeping in tight arcs, voices barking orders in clipped mechanical bursts. Ghost snarled, pressing against Carson's leg, his eyes locked onto the advancing officers. every muscle in his body thrumming with barely contained fury. Carson knew he couldn't outrun them, not burdened with evidence, not with Ghost bleeding from a shallow graze along his flank, not with the square surrounded on all sides. They had to stand and fight. A shouted order from Parker ripped across the air. "Take them down. The dog first." The first wave surged forward. Ghost exploded out from behind the pillar, a gray missile of rage and loyalty, slamming into the lead officer with such force that the man's rifle went spinning from his hands. Carson moved with him, covering the dog with precise, controlled shots that dropped 2 more assailants before they could bring their weapons fully to bear. The square became a battleground, the shouts of terrified civilians blending with the staccato rhythm of gunfire, the clash of boots against stone, the feral, furious barking of a warrior dog refusing to die quietly. Ghost fought like a demon unleashed. He tore through the strike team with savage efficiency, teeth flashing, claws scrabbling for purchase on blood-slicked concrete. Every bite, every tackle, every growl was a testament to years of training and a bond scrabble for purchase. Carson fought at his side, his gun steady, his heart a roaring furnace in his chest. Every instinct screamed to protect the dog, to protect the truth Ghost carried in his very flesh. But the odds were brutal. Parker's men had numbers, superior firepower, and no hesitation about killing their own to preserve the secret. Jamie shouted something. Carson barely heard it over the din, but the message was clear enough. Reinforcements were still minutes away. They wouldn't last that long. Ghost slammed into another officer, sending him sprawling, but a rifle cracked from the left and the dog yelped in pain. Carson's vision tunneled. He returned fire savagely, dropping the shooter before he could fire again, then grabbed Ghost's harness, pulling him back behind cover. Blood matted the dog's side, staining the concrete dark and slick, but Ghost refused to fall. He shook himself once, teeth bared, ready to rejoin the fray. Then, through the haze of battle, Carson saw movement beyond the strike team. Someone was pushing through the crowd, someone moving against the tide of fleeing civilians. Someone battered, bloodied, but standing, a figure limping heavily, one hand pressed against a dark stain spreading across his ribs, the other clutching a pistol grimly at his side. The face was pale, drawn with pain and fury, but unmistakable. Chief Richard Harrison, alive. The crowd gasped collectively, their screams faltering into stunned silence. Even Parker's men hesitated, glancing at each other, their carefully constructed lies crumbling in an instant. Harrison staggered forward, his words cutting through the gunfire like a blade. "You're following traitors. You're fighting the wrong enemy." The strike team wavered, confusion rippling through their ranks. Parker's voice cracked like a whip, desperate, commanding. "He's lying, he's compromised, finish this." But it was too late. The sight of their chief bloody but breathing, furious but standing, was stronger than any order barked from a coward hiding behind a megaphone. Carson rose to his feet, pulling Ghost up beside him. He met Harrison's blazing eyes across the battlefield, a silent agreement passing between them, forged in betrayal and blood. They would not die here. They would not let the rot consume everything they had fought to protect. Parker saw the tide turning and his face twisted into something hateful, something desperate. He barked into his radio, summoning whatever final forces he had left to crush the uprising. Carson knew the final push was coming, and they would have to survive it, together. The square pulsed with tension so thick it was almost tangible, the air vibrating with the unspent violence of men forced to confront their own crumbling loyalties. Parker's face twisted into a rictus of rage as he realized the illusion he had built was unraveling. The fortress of lies he had constructed crumbling beneath the simple, undeniable truth of Harrison's battered but unyielding presence. Carson stood his ground, Ghost at his side, their battered figures framed by the broken fragments of a town struggling to remember what honor was supposed to feel like. Harrison limped forward another step, blood dripping from between his fingers, his voice cutting across the square with raw authority. "You all swore an oath," he rasped, not to me, not to Parker, to the truth, to justice. Remember who you are." For a moment, silence reigned. Then slowly, weapons began to lower, one by one, as officers, some with shaking hands, some with grim resolve, turned their backs on Parker. His control slipped with each man who chose loyalty to conscience over loyalty to corruption. Parker screamed orders, threats, but they fell on deaf ears. Carson tightened his grip on Ghost's harness, ready for the inevitable. He knew Parker wouldn't surrender. Men like him never did. They fought until their last breath because admitting defeat meant confronting the ruin inside themselves. And Parker was too far gone for that. With a snarl of pure hatred, Parker raised his weapon. Not at Carson, not at the officers, but directly at Harrison. Time slowed to a crawl. Carson moved, muscles screaming, but he was too far. The shot rang out sharp and final, and Ghost moved faster than any man alive. The gray blur of muscle and devotion launched across the broken stones, hurling himself between Harrison and the bullet with a cry that was half snarl, half song of loyalty, a sound that tore through the square and into the souls of everyone who heard it. The bullet struck Ghost's side with a sickening thud, the force twisting his body mid-air before he crashed into Harrison's chest, knocking the chief backward into Carson's waiting arms. Ghost whimpered once, a broken, shuddering sound, and then lay still, the world frozen. Carson didn't remember raising his weapon, didn't remember pulling the trigger, but suddenly Parker was falling, blood blooming across his chest, the megaphone clattering uselessly from his fingers as he crumpled to the ground, eyes wide with the horror of a man who had just realized he could not outrun the justice he had mocked. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Harrison sagged against Carson, his voice a ragged whisper. "The files? Carson, the truth?" Carson nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He knelt beside Ghost, hands trembling, cradling the battered body of the dog who had saved them all, the dog who had carried secrets in his flesh, who had fought through fire and betrayal and fear without once faltering. Ghost's chest rose and fell once, twice, a slow, struggling rhythm that spoke of battles fought and won, of debts paid in full. Harrison knelt beside them, blood leaking from his side, one trembling hand resting lightly on Ghost's massive head. "He was always the plan," Harrison said, voice thick with grief and pride. "When I knew they were coming for me, I had to disappear, had to make them think I was dead." Ghost carried the evidence. Carson bowed his head, a silent promise burning in his chest. They would finish this. They would make Ghost's sacrifice mean something. Sirens wailed in the distance as the real law enforcement, the uncorrupted few, finally arrived. They swept into the square, securing Parker's men, tending to the wounded, restoring the shattered illusion of peace with careful, practiced hands. But Carson barely noticed. He stayed by Ghost's side, one hand tangled in the dog's blood-matted fur, whispering words no one else could hear, words of thanks, words of promise. Ghost's breathing slowed, his body shivering once, then settling into stillness, his head heavy against Carson's knee. A silence fell over the square, heavy with sorrow, with awe. When Harrison finally rose, he stood taller despite the blood staining his uniform, despite the pain etched into every line of his face. He faced the crowd, his voice steady, his spirit unbroken. "This town forgot what honor looks like," he said, his words carrying on the still, heavy air. "Today you all remembered." They buried Ghost beneath the largest oak tree in the square 3 days later. A hero's funeral attended by every man, woman, and child who still believed in truth. The files Ghost had protected led to dozens of arrests, the dismantling of a corrupt regime that had rotted Riverside from the inside out. Carson visited the grave often, sitting beneath the oak tree, his badge heavy against his chest, his heart heavier still. He remembered every fight, every sacrifice, every moment when hope had seemed too fragile to hold. And he remembered a dog with fire in his heart and loyalty carved into his bones. A dog who had reminded a broken town what it meant to fight for something greater than fear. Ghost was gone, but his legacy burned brighter than ever. And as long as Carson lived, that fire would never die. If this story moved you, if Ghost's loyalty and sacrifice touched something deep within your heart, I invite you to like this video and subscribe for more stories that remind us why we fight, why we believe, and why we endure. Tell me in the comments what moment hit you the hardest. Was it when Ghost refused to back down, or when Harrison stepped through the crowd still bleeding but unbroken? And where are you watching? I'd love to know where Ghost's story found you today. Your voice matters, your story matters. Let's keep them alive together.